In this video, we are going to discuss various properties of options. We're going to see what happens if things change, whether the option values go up or down. So first, some notation. So we've got small c is going to stand for European call option price. Small p is a European put option price. Capital C, American call. Capital P, American put. K is the strike of the option. Capital T is the maturity of the option. We also have S, the stock price or the asset price today. Sigma, the volatility of the stock price or asset price. Again, we haven't really defined sigma yet, but we can think of if sigma is bigger, then the asset is more volatile, and if sigma is smaller, then the asset is less volatile. We want to see the effects of that. So R is the risk-free interest rate, and D are the dividends being paid prior to the maturity of the option. Okay, first we're going to look at effects of option properties, various things that have to do with the option. In that list before, that would be the strike and the maturity. So what happens to option prices when we look at different options with different strikes and different maturities? Okay, so European call, we're thinking about the strike. So if you have two European calls on the same asset with different strikes and the same maturity, then the one with the lower strike is worth more. Right, this is a pretty natural thing for calls. And for two European puts on the same asset with different strikes and same maturity, the one with a higher strike is worth more. So a greater strike is going to increase its price. American calls are the same. So the one with the lower strike is worth more. And an American put is the same as European puts. The one with the lower strike, the higher strike, is worth more. Next, we have to think about maturity. And maturity is a little bit strange and so slightly unintuitive. So, European calls. So, European calls, it depends. And so let's talk about what it depends on. So sometimes an option with a longer maturity is worth more, and sometimes it's worth less for European call options. So let's think about this. So generally, longer dated options have greater values, since extending the maturity of the option increases the chance the option is going to be exercised, because there's a greater probability that the underlying asset, if we're thinking about calls, achieves higher prices if we wait longer. Now for European calls, the situation can be more complex, and so I'm going to give you an example of this complexity. So consider two European call options, one that expires today and one that expires tomorrow. Each option has a strike of 100 and the underlying stock has a price of 105. Oh yeah, the asset pays a dividend, $20, that goes X dividend tomorrow. So X dividend means that tomorrow that dividend is going to come out of the stock price, tomorrow morning at the open. So today's option can be exercised for a payout of 5. The asset's trading at 105. It's a European option, so we can exercise it today. Assets trading at 105, strike is 100, we make $5. Tomorrow, however, that dividend, that enormous dividend, is going to come out of the stock price, and so the stock price we expect to be around 85, 105 minus the 20. Now that means it's very unlikely that tomorrow's option is ever going to be exercised. Thus today's option is worth more than tomorrow's option. Tomorrow's option is basically worthless. Today's option is worth 5. Now, most of the time, this doesn't happen. So most of the time, an option with a greater maturity is worth more than an option with a shorter maturity, but sometimes it's not necessarily true. Okay, let's go back. Let's think about European puts. You can guess where this is going. If you have two European put options on the same asset with the same strike and different maturities, again, it depends. Now, this is a slightly different example for us. So, generally, longer dated options have greater values, but for puts, European put options, the situation can be more complex. And so I'm going to do a slightly contrived example here. Consider two European put options, one that expires today and one that expires tomorrow. Each option has a strike of 5, and the underlying asset is a loaf of bread worth $3. And we're in a country with hyperinflation. If you exercise today's option, you make 2, because you sell the bread worth $3 for 5, so you make $2. Tomorrow, however, we expect the price of the loaf of bread might triple, and thus the bread tomorrow is worth 9. tomorrow's option is worthless because you wouldn't sell something worth $9 for $5. Thus, today's option is worth more than tomorrow's. Now, most of the time this doesn't happen, but you can see in certain circumstances this can happen. Okay, let's go back. American calls. So if you have two American call options on the same asset with the same strike and different maturities, the one with the later maturity is worth more. And that one's pretty easy to see. So the one with the later maturity is worth more. Why? Because the one with the later maturity has all of the same exercise opportunities that the one with the shorter maturity has, plus some more for that last day. American put options work the same way. If you have two American put options on the same asset with the same strike and different maturities, the one with the later maturity is worth more. So just to summarize, for call options, if the strike goes up, price of the call goes down. For put options, if the strike goes up, price of the option goes up. Maturities, European options, it depends. American options with greater maturities are always worth more than those with shorter maturities. Okay, now we're going to think about the market, right? So some of our parameters that we're thinking about are the market parameters, and we're going to think about how those affect option prices. Okay, so spot, the asset price. If the asset price increases, European calls become more valuable. Why? Because they're more likely to be exercised. European puts, if the asset price increases, European put options become less likely to be exercised, and thus they decrease in value. American calls, same as European calls. If the asset price increases, the American call value goes up. American puts, same as European puts. If the asset price increases, the American put option becomes less valuable. Volatility. If the volatility of an asset increases, then a European call option becomes more likely to be exercised and thus increases in value. Now, this is true for all options, and so let's spend a little bit of time thinking about this particular situation. Okay, if the asset becomes more volatile, then the value of any option increases. And this is easiest to think about in a picture. So, we're not rigorously defining volatility, we'll do that later. But the following pictures are of the payout of a call option and the probability density function of the asset, where the asset has a volatility of either 10% or 20%. So let's look at these pictures. The one on the left is volatility of 10%. The one on the right is a volatility of 20%. Now what we notice is the payout's the same in both pictures, but the probability density function is wider with a volatility of 20% and narrower with a volatility of 10%. Now, again, this is really rough, but if you look at these probability density functions, the probability of zero payout, and that's going to be roughly a half in this picture, is the same whether we have a wide probability density function or a narrow probability density function. So that's pretty much the same. So the difference between these two is that in the volatility 20% picture, there is a much greater probability of a much bigger payout than with the volatility of 10%. And that greater probability of a bigger payout is worth money, and thus the payout, and thus the value of an option with volatility 20% on an asset with volatility 20% is greater than that volatility 10%. Volatility increases, the value of the option increases. And this is true for all options. All right, interest rates. Interest rates are a little confusing, so we'll spend a little time here as well. If interest rates increase, then the European call option becomes more valuable. And let's think about why, because there are two effects. So increased interest rates have two effects on option prices. The first is that future cash flows, again, options pay sometime in the future, those future cash flows are discounted with higher rates. This has the effect of decreasing the option value. Second, the forward price of the asset, remember for a simple asset, the forward price is SE to the RT, a greater R is going to increase the forward price. And again, if you think about those distributions of possible values, a higher forward price shifts the whole distribution up. And this is a really significant effect. So, when interest rates increase, The second effect makes European calls more likely to be exercised and thus more valuable. The money you receive is going to be discounted at a higher rate, and so it's not going to be worth quite as much more. But basically, that second effect, the forward price going up, means that European call options are greater. European put options, now we have both effects, but they both work against the option. So if interest rates increase, European put option becomes less valuable. Again, it's the same thing. Future cash flows are discounted with higher rates, and the forward price of the asset increases. Well, for European put, that forward price of the asset increasing means it's less likely to be exercised, and then the money you're going to receive is not worth as much either. So European put options become less valuable. Now, American calls work the same as European calls, and American puts work the same as European puts. Now we can think about dividends. Dividends are pretty easy at this point, having walked through the interest rates. If the dividend paid before the maturity of the option increases, well, what does that do? That pushes the forward price down. Makes calls less valuable and puts more valuable. Oop, got that written down wrong. Calls less valuable, puts more valuable. And to summarize, we've got this. Spot price going up increases the value of calls, decreases the value of puts. Volatility going up increases the value of all options. Interest rates going up increases the value of calls, decreases the value of puts. Dividends going up decreases the value of calls, increases the value of puts.